Today, I'll be ranking every support champion in the game based on whether or not you should main them in low elo. And to start things off, I just want to go ahead and say that my interpretation of low elo might be a little bit different than yours. I think high elo is D2 and up. Low elo is going to be anything lower than D2. So keep that in mind. If you fall within that range, that's the target audience that I'm looking for. And basically, what I'm going to be doing is factoring in a few different things based on like how meta they've been over the past few seasons, or how good they are in solo queue specifically, how mechanically difficult these champions may be. More times than not, we're going to be aiming towards the champions who are a little bit easier to use in solo queue and are just easier to operate in general because the mechanics are not as difficult as some of the other ones. So that's kind of what we're looking for. We're just going to go one by one here. We'll crank through this real quick. Alistar. I think Alistar is a really solid engage support, especially for low elo players, for beginners. He allows you to learn how to engage from the support position without making things overly complicated, without making things too difficult. Very, very simple combo. WQ, WQ, WQ. There are, of course, other ways that you can use Alistar on a higher mechanical difficulty level. But for the most part, if you really break things down, he can be played very simply. I think Helicopter is also a really good example of how one-tricking this champion, you can go a long way with it. I'm going to go ahead and put this in main, and I guess we should stop here and just go through these real quick. Top tier is going to be champions that are worthy of one-tricking. Worthy of maining is the second tier. Champions that are playable, like champions that might be worth having in your champion pool, but aren't super great. Then there's bad champs to main, and champions you should never, ever be touching. And speaking of champions you should never, ever be touching, that leads us right into Bard, who is just a very difficult mechanical champion. He is hardly ever played to his fullest potential. Even in higher ranks, you see people messing up with Bard. He takes a lot of timing. He takes a lot of patience. You have to be really good at knowing how to use your ulti in different ways, whether it's engaging or peeling. And overall, this champion doesn't have a whole lot of damage, so it's not like you can carry the game through damage output or anything like that. Overall, it's just a champion that has a lot of utility, and if you're not using your utility well enough, not going to be good for lower ranks. A champion that is going to be very good for higher ranks, or for lower ranks rather, is going to be Blitzcrank. I said Alistar is a good engaged support for lower ranks because of how simple he is. It doesn't get any simpler than Blitzcrank. It's literally land your hooks, you win the game. Follow that up with the silence and a knock up. It makes it really, really easy for your team to follow up as well. Considering someone like Alistar, you're going into the enemy team, but Blitzcrank brings the enemy team to you. Overall, a really solid champion. And I really like him in lower ranks specifically. Brand is a tricky one. Brand is better in lower ranks than he is in higher ranks. He's pretty much like unplayable in high elo, but playable in low elo. But just because he's playable in low elo doesn't mean that he's necessarily super good for one tricking or maining this champion. I think it's good to have him in your champion pool as a lower ranked player because having that ability to play an AP champion from the support role can be really beneficial, especially because people don't always take things into account in champion select as far as like, AP and AD ratios. So sometimes you might have to provide the AP damage as a support. So I think Brand is okay to have in your champion pool. We'll put him in playable, unplayable in high elo, but works in low elo. Brom's a tricky one because Brom is playable in high elo, but even then, he's not great. Overall, Brom just isn't a very good solo queue champion. He's more so a champion that's fit for competitive play. You really have to rely around your teammates. I'm kind of torn between putting him in bad and never play this champion. I think there's definitely an argument to put him here, but from my personal experience, I've never really found Braum to be all that useful in solo queue, so I'll throw him down here and never. A couple of these champions I'll just throw to the bottom because I don't think that they're necessarily super meta. So like Galio's down here, Shaco's down here, Gragas is down there, and I'm sure we'll have a couple of that we come across that won't make it to the tier list. Up next is going to be Janna. Janna is a tricky one in my opinion because I actually think she has a high mechanical ceiling, which sounds weird to say that about an Enchantress support because Enchantress supports are typically a little bit easier to pilot. But from my experience, I've always kind of struggled a little bit with Janna because there is a huge difference between like the best Janna players and like the average Janna players. And I just think that there's a lot that you could do with this champion. And because of her high mechanical ceiling, in my opinion, I don't think she's all that good for lower ranked players. I also just think that she doesn't have a whole lot of carry potential. I'll just put her in bad. Karma is another one of those champions that is better in higher ranks, worse in lower ranks, and that's because she's a champion that you can't just play as a poking champion and you can't just play her as a backline champion. You have to really know your limitations and try to do a little bit of both, which lower ranked players tend to struggle with a little bit more. She's not unplayable. I just think, again, she's not played correctly in lower ranks. So not going to put her down in the bottom and the never play this champion, but definitely lower ranked players, I wouldn't advise playing too much Karma. Leona, I think, fits kind of the same category as Alistar, actually. Just a very simple, engaged support. I think she provides a little bit more than Alistar, more times than not. But as far as just being super meta, because she's so simplistic, she sometimes gets uh, kind of outshined by other engaged supports. And again, just because I think she's so similar to Alistar, I'll just go ahead and put her in the same tier here. I could probably see an argument to put her up in the one trick tier, but we'll throw her down here just to play things safe. Lulu is a champion that you guys might think is really good to play in general, whether it's in higher or lower ranks, because you see her so often. And yes, she's annoying to play against, but she doesn't have that much agency. She doesn't have that much carry potential. I think she's kind of similar to Janet in the sense that you're just playing an Enchantress support that's not going to provide a whole lot of carry potential and agency to yourself. So not a champion that you want to be playing yourself if you're looking to try to carry games and climb up the ranks. That's kind of what you're going to see through a lot of these champions here that I'm recommending, because of course the end goal for a lot of these, a lot of those of you guys who are watching is going to be to climb. So I'm recommending champions that are going to allow you to have more impact in your games and allow you to climb. Lux is another one of those champions, very similar to Brand. I think she's maybe even a little bit easier to play than Brand, but still kind of accomplishes the same thing. AP support, good CC. I would probably put her a little bit above Brand, but again, I don't think she's good enough to be maining this champion because I don't think Lux support overall is a champion you want to be playing all too much in solo queue. But there's definitely times where you can make it work if your team needs AP, or if you have a poke comp, or if you want to pair it with something like Sivir and try to outrange your opponent in the bot lane. That could definitely work as well. Morgana is a champion that is actually good for beginners, but I don't think she's all that strong. And I think Morgana and Braum are pretty similar champions in the sense that if they were overtuned, they'd be way too annoying to play up against. And because Morgana can be a frustrating champion to play up against between her snare and her point and click shield that negates CC, she's a champion that's in the game that's supposed to be friendly for newer players to pick up and learn how to play the game. But she's not one that's supposed to be strong enough to actually be played in solo queue. You can still pick your spots and pick her kind of as a counter to CC heavy compositions, but overall not that great. I'm between playable and bad here, but just because she hasn't really seen the meta all too much in the past few seasons off the top of my head, I just don't really see a spot for her that she's going to be worth playing all the time. Again, Nami, pretty similar to the other Enchantress supports. I think if you have a duo, Nami's really good at enabling ADCs to play more aggressive. We all know about Lucian Nami and how impressive that could be. And she does have some trade, like ability to trade in the lane, and has a little bit more damage outputs than some of these other enchanters. But still, at the end of the day, if you're looking to climb, if you're looking to make your way out of low elo, you don't necessarily want to be playing enchanters. So moving on from Nami, Nautilus, not a whole lot to say here. Kind of accomplishes the same thing as Leon and Alistar, one of the easier engaged supports to play in the game. Accomplishes the same thing. I still think Blitzcrank is going to be a little bit higher than that. Pantheon, not really super meta. Pike and Bard are pretty similar in my opinion as far as how mechanically difficult they can be. So I think just based on that, Pike is going to be a little bit too difficult to be playing in the lower ranks. You're not going to be able to play him to his fullest potential, and I guess that's one of the main things I'm trying to get across here. I'm not trying to say if you're a low elo player, you're terrible at the game and you should never play any difficult champions. That's not what I'm saying. I'm basically just trying to break it down to the fact that if you are a lower ranked player, you won't be able to play a champion to their fullest potential. So instead, you should try to focus on some of the champions that are easier to master because you're going to have more success on those champions. Rakan is another one of those champions who has somewhat of a high ceiling, but he also has a low floor. And what I mean by that is, yes, if you are a masterful Rakan, you can play him at a super high level. But if you are also just kind of a beginner Rakan, you can also get away with some things. Um, I think I'm gonna put him in playable. I think just because he can be a little mechanically difficult makes me want to drop him down a little bit, because if you're in lower ranks, why might as well just play something a little bit easier to engage with, like Alistar, Leon, or Nautilus. But you still can't get a lot accomplished with Rakan playing him at a lower level. So I think I'll put him there. Rel, I'm between bad and never here. Rel is just a such a clunky champion. And this might have a lot of bias personally, because personally, I've really struggled with this champion compared to every other engaged support in the game. It's really difficult to pick your spots. And yeah, like I said, I'm between bad and never, but taking my own personal bias into account here, Rel is just so hard to find good angles to engage on. So I'm going to go ahead and put it there. Up next is going to be Senna. Senna, I think, is going to be playable. Good damage option, but in lower ranks, you kind of have to play safe, and a lot of people don't really know how to play safe or know how to position properly. And Sen as a champion that obviously don't have any mobility, it's going to be a little bit more difficult to stay alive and put out damage. If you are able to scale and get to late game, and you have good position, you're definitely going to make this pick work. But for the most part, between the fact that it's hard to position as this champion, on top of the fact that in higher ranks people pair picks with Senna a little bit more strategically than you might see in lower ranks, I think playable is going to be a good spot for her. Seraphine, just another enchanter here. I think she has a little bit more agency than some of these other supports, enchanter supports in the game, because she does have that long range ulti that can really make a difference in team fights. She also has some capability to build some damage, so I kind of like her a little bit more. But overall, she's kind of not seeing the meta as much anymore these days. I think over the past couple seasons since her release, Riot had her in a spot that she was way too strong. And I think that they're going to try to avoid seeing Seraphine in a spot like that in the near future. So I don't think she's going to be seeing any buffs. I don't think she's going to be brought back into the meta anytime soon. So if she were stronger, I think her kit is definitely good enough to make her playable in lower ranks, but I just don't see her being super meta, super strong in the near future. Up next is Sona. Sona's definitely going to go in either main or playable. And I think I'm actually going to put Sona in main, because looking at the rest of the available champions here, I think she might be the best enchanter support to play in the game. Good damage output, CC, has good laning phase, has good scaling. It's pretty much the same idea as Seraphine, except Seraphine got nerfed, so she's a little bit weaker, and Sona remains to be a pretty good, solid champion as far as providing utility, but also CC, but also damage, strong early, strong late. And I do want to have some representation for enchanter supports higher in this list. And again, looking down at what's left here, I think Sona is going to be the best option. So Sona definitely worthy of a main. Don't know if I would necessarily one trick her, but I definitely like her as a main. Soraka is going to go in either bad or never. I think I'm going to throw her in bad. Similar to Rakan, believe it or not, Soraka can be played at a pretty high level, and a lot of people just don't understand how to position properly as her, how to have good damage output as her, when to be putting your silence down. So people can't play her at a high enough level in lower ranks. But it's, like I said, similar to Rakan in the sense that you could play her at a pretty low floor and still be able to accomplish a lot. But at the end of the day, she's still an enchantress support, so not going to be all that great. Tom Kench, don't really see him too much in support these days, and I'm not going to dive too much into this because he's pretty similar to Braum in the sense that he's really good in competitive play, not good in solo queue, and that's kind of where I rest my case. Tarek is a really interesting champion because for a few years now, he's actually had a really high pick rate, or excuse me, really high win rate with a really small pick rate. So there's just not a whole lot of evidence to support Tarek being a strong champion. I kind of struggle to play him myself, and he's just not played enough to have any kind of backup on my opinion here. So just to play things safe, because I can't really provide any evidence to like support him being higher, I'm just gonna play it safe and put him in never. I just don't think he's necessarily going to be one of the better champions to be pulling out in lower ranks, similar to Thresh. If there's one champion that I really wanted to emphasize on pretty much never play this champion ever in lower ranks, it's going to be Thresh, and that's because if you look at his win rates by rank, it goes up and up every single rank you go up. But of course, with that being said, it goes lower and lower every rank that you go down. So people who are playing this champion in Iron are winning at like a 40% win rate, whereas people who are playing this champion in Challenger have like a 55% win rate. It's just a very difficult champion to play to his fullest potential, and a champion that's going to be meant more for higher ranks. Similar to Vel'Koz, I mean, this champion, I've never really been able to wrap my head around him trying to factor in geometry and angles and stuff like that while playing League of Legends. It's just mind boggling to me. Credit to all of the, Vel'Koz mains out there that make it work, but I don't know how they do that. How they do it, I wouldn't recommend trying to do it yourself. Yumi, if I had made this video a year ago, she might be up here because she before the recent rework and changes, just a super reliable champion that was really, really broken, that you could play safe and you could have free scaling. It was also good in the lane, was also good late game. But of course, we're making this video now, not a year ago. And the direction that Riot is choosing to go with Yumi is they want this to be an entry-level champion for people to learn the game, but they don't ever want it to be a champion that is good in solo queue. I think last time I looked at her win rate since the changes was like 46% or something like that. Just a champion that was way too strong for way too long and very frustrating to play against. And I don't think Riot wants to see this champion be in the spotlight moving forward. So just not going to be a great champion. That's where I'll leave her at. Zillion, another one of those champions, has a high ceiling but also a low floor. He's probably playable. I'm between playable and bad here. I'm going to play it safe and put him in bad just because I think he can be a little difficult to play. Zyra, I think I'm just going to throw all the AP mages in the same category here. Lux, Brand, Zyra kind of provide all the same thing. I will say if you're trying to choose between one or the other, Lux is going to be better for poke. She's going to be better for shoving in waves. Pairs better with like long range ADCs, whether that's like a Caitlyn or a Varus. Brand is just going to be raw damage output. If you need extra damage, Brand should be able to out damage a champion like Lux and Zyra. Zyra is going to provide a little bit more CC AoE team fighting. So they're all good AP supports that are playable, but they accomplish things a little differently. Xerath is someone that can be played as support, but I'm going to throw him down here with the other champions that you don't see all too often, as well as Zac. Annie, I don't know if I really want to include this because Annie's kind of a newer support pick, and I don't know if this video will last long enough for this to still apply in the future. So since Annie's such a newer support pick, and I don't know if she's necessarily going to be hanging out in the support meta for much longer, we're not going to include her on this list either. Amumu, I feel like, is an off-meta support that's hung around long enough, so I'll include him on the list, but I think he's pretty similar to these engaged supports, but I'll just put him in playable because I think because he's not a standard support, it takes a little bit more skill to understand like how to actually use him to the best of your advantage or best of your ability. Nico, no. Pantheon, no. Heimerdinger, no. Renata, I definitely think is playable and has some more playmaking potential than some of these other Enchantress supports. And again, I want to have some kind of representation of Enchantress supports on this list. So I think she's a little bit worse than Sona, but a little bit better than all these other Enchantress supports that kind of play more in the back line. Renata has the ability to step up, make plays with her Q, mixing in auto attacks to proc her passive with her ulti, stuff like that. We're not going to include Ashe here. And Milio is really hard to have an opinion on him because at the time of recording this, he hasn't been out all too long. I'm just going to play it safe and throw him in with the rest of the enchanters. That might be something that changes in the future. But from the small sample size that I've seen him so far, he doesn't have a whole lot of carry potential himself, relies more on his teammates, just like a lot of these other enchantress supports. And then the rest of these champions that you see down here are kind of these like off-meta niche supports that don't really have a spot on this list, so we'll leave all of them out. And that will kind of complete our list here. I didn't have an idea of how I was going to make this list before I went into it, kind of just made it as we went along. And to my surprise, there's only one champion that I would really recommend one-tricking. I would say that any of these champions in main could probably fall into that category as well. But I do like the fact that I have Blitzcrank a tier above every other support champion because I do think he's just super simple, has good carry potential, brings the enemy to your team. I think that's probably like the most important factor. You don't have to rely on your team following up. You just bring the enemy into your team and they don't have a choice. They're already right there in front of the enemy that you pulled in. So Blitzcrank, Alistar, Leona, Nautilus, Sona, all really good options. I think Lux, Brand, Zyra, Rakan, Senna, Mumu, Renata can all work as well, more so as backup choices to some of these champions. I really wouldn't touch some of these champions that I have in bad, and I would obviously never touch any of these champions that I have down here at the bottom. And I guess with all this in mind, my recommendation to you would be, take this list and try to make a champion pool yourself, like 2 to 3 to 4 picks. And of course, you can still take into account your own personal preference. If all the champions that are in your champion pool are down here in the bottom 2 tiers, that doesn't mean that you have to necessarily never play these champions ever again. But if you are choosing between should I be picking someone like Leona or should I be picking someone like Thresh, then you could take this tier list into account and say, okay, maybe Leona's going to be a better option. So that'll wrap up this tier list for champions that you should be maining or playing or have in your champion pool in lower ranks. Again, lower ranks for me is like under D2. But take everything into account. Take your own personal champion pool into account and use this to the best of your ability to help yourself climb in your games. Thank you guys so much for watching to the end of this video. I really do appreciate it. If you made it this far and you enjoyed this video, I would really appreciate it if you could leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you have not done so already. That'll do it for me, though. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.